Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Wednesday. This is Seattle Now. Seattle City Councilmember Kshama Sawant is facing a rare recall election. Her constituents in District 3 will decide whether she stays or goes. KUOW's David Hyde is here to explain how we got here and what voters will decide. Right after some news. The family of a mother of four killed by Seattle police has agreed to a $3.5 million settlement with the city. Charlena Lyles was shot in her home by two Seattle police officers in 2017 when they responded to a 911 call saying she'd been burglarized. The officers said she brandished a knife, and they shot her because they feared for their safety. SPD said yesterday they hope that this tragic case continues to serve to drive momentum towards comprehensive, holistic reform. A proposal to set guidelines for clearing encampments in unincorporated King County failed a vote yesterday. The plan would have required people camped on public property to move if the situation led to health or fire hazards, crime, or blocked access to schools or playgrounds. Opponents who voted it down said it didn't offer enough in the way of help. The 2020 point-in-time count found nearly 12,000 people living without permanent shelter in King County. And Microsoft Chairman and CEO Satya Nadella has just made his biggest stock trade. He unloaded more than half his stake in the company last week. Nadella sold nearly 840,000 shares of Microsoft just before Thanksgiving, netting him about $285 million, according to a filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The company says it was for personal financial planning and diversification reasons. The sale comes just before Washington's new 7% capital gains tax takes effect next month.
Honestly, the recall campaign feels like fishing for whatever is going to possibly be a reason for a recall because they don't like Sawant.
So is her place better as an advocate rather than as a council person? And that's one of the things that I'll be thinking about.
From what I've heard, I think that she should be recalled. I think that she is doing a terrible job across the board. And I think that she needs to actually put actions where her words are.
We just heard from some Capitol Hill voters weighing in on the recall. City Councilmember Kshama Sawant. On December 7th, voters in District 3 will decide whether Sawant stays in her current council position. The district covers a swath of central Seattle from Montlake to Mount Baker. Sawant has been a powerful voice on the council who's worked to push the city further left on issues from minimum wage to homelessness. The recall campaign centers around charges against her for her actions in three separate incidents. KUOW political reporter David Hyde is here to help us unpack this vote. Hey, David, thanks for taking the time.
Hi, Trish. Happy to help unpack.
Okay, so here we are. Recalls are pretty rare, though. What is the deal here, and how does this work?
Yeah, in this case, there are three formal charges of malfeasance, which basically charges that Sawant broke certain laws, and that's how it works here. As you know, in other states like California, just had a big recall. Anyone can basically bring a recall for purely political reasons. Here in Washington state, it first has to get past the courts. And in this case, the court ruled that there's enough evidence that Sawant broke laws for the recall to go ahead. And no, they're not saying that she did it or she didn't. They're just saying it can go to trial, essentially, or a recall. And now it's up to District 3 to act as a sort of jury and decide.
But how did we get here? Who is actually trying to recall their council member?
This one started with a Capitol Hill man named Ernie Liu, and it just kind of snowballed from there. The recall campaign itself is getting financial support, mostly from folks who actually live in District 3, but quite a few of those donors, as Sawant's side correctly points out, are also Trump supporters. And there's also now an independent expenditure campaign that's raising funds. But if the question is support for this initiative kind of more broadly beyond the money, there just aren't that many Trump supporters in Seattle to decide really anything, especially in District 3, which is known as the most progressive district in a very progressive city. And there's really a lot of political ground between supporting Trump and supporting Sawant. In any case, campaign organizers say it's all about these three charges.
All right, well, let's talk about them. Sawant was pretty visible during the 2020 summer protests. We saw her at Mayor Jenny Durkin's house and at City Hall, both of which were part of the recall campaign. What is she specifically charged with?
The first one, she's accused of participating or leading a march to Mayor Jenny Durkin's home when, as a former U.S. attorney, Durkin's address is protected information, right? And I was actually doing a little bit of reading about this law just last night. It turns out that Washington was the first state in the country to pass what's called an address confidentiality program back in 1991. Originally, the idea was to protect people who were targets of things like stalking or domestic violence. But later, it was expanded to include criminal justice employees, people who are getting death threats in their jobs for that sort of thing. And people who are new to Seattle might not know this, but a former assistant U.S. attorney for Western Washington named Thomas Wales was shot to death at his home address in Seattle back in 2001. For her part, Sawant says, look, she was just invited to speak at the rally. She did so in solidarity. She didn't organize it. And for that matter, she doesn't know Durkin's address. She didn't know it then. She still doesn't know it. And she told me that the rally organizers in this instance included folks whose families had been killed by Seattle police, like Charlena Lyles' family, and that she doesn't believe the organizers themselves knew about this confidentiality law when they marched to the mayor's house. This more broadly fits into her argument that these charges are really attack on her support for Black Lives Matter protests.
Okay, so she was also at City Hall. That's another charge.
Right. That one, she led hundreds of protesters inside City Hall after hours during a pandemic. This was the height of the protests 2 summers ago against police violence. For her part, Sawant says she broke no law, or at least that's what police told her at the time, that people wore masks and that they passed around hand sanitizer and that this wasn't some kind of super spreader event.
Okay, another charge was the use of city money on the Tax Amazon initiative. Give me some context here, because she did pay a fine. She paid double the fine, no?
Yeah, this is, that she used city resources to support this ballot initiative effort for a Tax Amazon campaign, one that never ultimately got on the ballot, essentially because the city council passed a head tax and it sort of made that campaign less important. Sawant said she's already paid the fine. And she also said that there are other city council members who have also violated these sorts of rules without being recalled. So she argues that she's being singled out.
Okay, all right. Sawant calls these charges a smokescreen for her politics. What are you hearing about that?
On the Sawant side, that she's an uncompromising fighter for issues including rent control, higher taxes on Amazon that we just talked about, taxes on big business, and essentially that the capitalist ruling class doesn't like her because of that she's a proud socialist. And more specifically, she's a member of a Trotskyist political party called Socialist Alternative, which sees each of these political battles for reform within the capitalist system as also kind of an educational vehicle that when the capitalist class fights back, that helps raise working class consciousness. So those battles are kind of an essential part of really who she is and how I think both sides have seen her here in Seattle.
All right. Well, the other thing that's being kicked around here by Sawant supporters is that they say this is an undemocratic election. They say it was intentional that the vote was being held after the general election. Let's talk a little bit about the impact holding this recall during an off year and just after the November election.
Yeah, it's even hard on us reporters at this point. But off year, odd year elections like 2021 always see lower turnout, as we saw in November, let's say compared to presidential election years like 2020. Typically, that means fewer younger voters, and that can hurt progressive candidates. And this one, a December election sandwiched in the middle of the holidays, it could be even worse. That said, Sawant's supporters are out there canvassing every single door multiple times. In some cases, folks on Capitol Hill told me their side is really fired up. So it's possible that low turnout might even help them, or that at least it's a wash. We're really only going to know, what the turnout story is after Election Day.
What should we expect if the recall goes through and she no longer holds office?
This is interesting. So the city council would vote on her temporary replacement, and it's not 100% clear yet what the timing would be, whether or not that would be before or after the new city council takes office in January of 2022. But either way, the council majority is essentially going to be progressive left, so it seems very likely that they're going to replace her with another progressive left candidate, at least temporarily, although perhaps not someone as far left as Sawant herself. And then the voters get to decide. Next year, 2022, would be an even year election. That vote would tend to favor the progressive candidates. So if that ends up happening, be careful what you wish for if you're supporting the recall, perhaps.
All right, before I let you go, voting by mail usually means we have to wait a couple of days for the results, and we see the ballots going for more liberal candidates usually in those cases. When will we know the results of the recall election? Typically, yes, exactly right. By Friday, the most progressive votes tend to come late in Seattle, not necessarily outside Seattle, but definitely in Seattle. 2019, Sawant was way behind on election night. She saw this huge swing in her favor, and of course she won. But this time, the anti-recall campaign's been urging their supporters to vote early. So who knows? We'll see what happens. All right, we'll follow your coverage. KUOW's David Hyde. Thank you. Thanks, Trish. Thanks for listening. Jenny Cecil Moore produced today's show, which is also made by Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, Diana Opong, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy.